By now, you are probably already keenly aware that reading philosophy is difficult. There are some helpful hints that Gary Kessler provides in the text for reading philosophy, and these can be found actually on pages 26 through 28 of the course textbook. I would like here briefly to identify some of the key ideas that he lays out that can help you for the rest of this course. First of all, when he talks about how to read philosophy, he says that one of the things that you should do is to read the material at least twice. Now, this might be at first glance something that is off-putting because it is painful enough with some of the text to read it once. And to give it a second reading, maybe even a third, when there are a lot more enjoyable things to do in life, well, I can understand that this is quite challenging. Nonetheless, this is a really helpful tool. When you read the text the first time, you may not get a lot from it, depending on what text it is. But there are other things, there's so much more that you will get from the text when you read it a second time, because you'll have the general gist of the overall arguments that are laid out, of the overall themes and points that the text wishes to kind of lay out for you. So reading the material at least twice is a really good tip. Reading actively and with a purpose. So when you read the text, ask yourself, what is this really about? Don't read it like you would some other textbooks where maybe you just want to pull out some kind of rote facts to memorize. When you're reading philosophy, it's very important that you read actively. So you start asking questions. You start wondering as to what the assumptions are in the text. You have a purpose. You might want to clear your space, whatever space that is, if it's a room in a residence hall or even in the library, if you can find a quiet place. You will probably want to get rid of distractions because you really need focus in order to understand what is happening in these texts. The other thing is, he says, you need to read analytically and sympathetically. Now, to read analytically, as most of you may know, is to read in such a way that you try to tear things apart. The word analysis itself comes from two Greek roots, ana and luane, which actually means to break apart or to unfasten. And so what you probably want to do is, as you're reading, look at how the text could be broken up. What are some of the constituent points that are introduced in the text? And how can you kind of dissect, essentially, the key ideas? And with many of these texts, the philosophers are trying to build an argument, and those arguments are usually along some kind of logical lines. And so it's very helpful to try to trace back to understand what are the premises. In other words, what are some of the foundational kinds of claims that are made? He also says to read sympathetically, which has to do with try to get into that person's head. Try to understand what is it that they're wishing to share with you, and perhaps even why are they wishing to share that with you. He says some analytical questions that you can ask and answer as you read is, what is the thesis? Essentially the central idea or main point. If you know that the text is dealing with areas such as epistemology, you know that the main point is going to have to do with something regarding how do we know what we know. So look at what is his main point in that argument or in that article. What are the major points that he makes or she makes in developing and supporting that thesis? So at first glance you might say, I don't know if I really accept their argument here. That is, I don't know if I accept George Berkeley. I'll use that as an example. I don't know if I accept his argument that in fact all of reality is immaterial and is simply some kind of mind reality. At first glance that seems really odd. But when you look through his text and try to unpack it, try to understand why is he arguing that, what are some of the major points that he raises in developing that and in supporting that notion, You may find yourself, after reading the text perhaps a second time, saying, he makes a really good point, and it's hard to run away from the point that he is making. Ask the third bullet point there, how key terms are defined. First of all, there will be a lot of new words in these different texts. There will also be some words that not only are new, but are particular to the discipline of philosophy. So look at some of those key terms, maybe look them up. Maybe you can even cross-reference them to find out where else they appear within the course textbook and other philosophical literature, if you are so inclined, to gain an understanding as to what those key terms are and how they become defined in the particular article that you are reading. Ask what are the basic assumptions that are made by the author. Perhaps they're coming from a space where they're building on a foundation that they have not expressed, and they're basically assuming certain ideas. And so ask yourself what those assumptions are. And then finally, what are the important implications of the author's position? If you were to draw it out, if you were to ask yourself the question, if I believed this way, and perhaps if many others and even everyone believed this way, what would be the implications? How would that impact our society, let's say? How would that impact the way we even talk to one another, the way we construct our societies? We can go down a long list. The other item that he talks about is some critical questions that can help you to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of the selections. So automatically from the outset, you'll notice he is identifying that there are some real strengths in some of the selections, and that some of them are actually, in fact, weaker. You'll even notice that in the text, essentially what Gary Kessler has done is he presents opposing sides to different ideas. So, for example, when we look at the epistemology question, you'll notice that he takes one side of the kind of epistemological world that seems to believe that we can only know reality, we can only know truth, we can only arrive at certainty by using our rational minds, in some sense divorced from our regular senses. But then there's another side, and he presents that opposing viewpoint that says, no, we know reality, perhaps not with entire certainty, but with greater surety, I'll put it that way, by using our senses and by basing our claims on what we experience in the world. Now, those are two opposing sides to epistemological theory. What are some of the strengths to the one side, and what are some of the strengths on the other side? What are some of the weaknesses and on one side and some of the weaknesses on the other side? So those are really good questions to ask while you're reading. What are some of the strengths of this argument? Is what is said clear? Maybe it is not entirely clear to you. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's not clear. Per se, it may mean that it would be clear to people who have studied philosophy for many years, but to someone who is just beginning to study philosophy, it's not clear. It's good to identify that. Is it not clear because you are new to the field, or is it not clear because the person, gosh darn it, is just kind of writing in circles? They're not saying what they mean quite as clearly as they really could. Those are good questions to ask. Are adequate definitions given for important concepts? Can you think of counterexamples to those concepts? So in other words, especially if they provide examples to some of those concepts, are there some better examples that you can think of? Or are there some examples that would contradict the concept that they are presenting? Are the arguments adequate to support the claims? For example, are the premises true, the assumptions dubious? I have spoken about that already, but again, important to keep in mind. Especially if you find yourself in the position where you are persuaded by the particular conclusion that is drawn ask yourself the question, am I persuaded just because this goes along with what I have already believed? Am I persuaded because this is a new idea that I find fascinating? And am I persuaded because the way this is laid out to me actually does make sense? It actually does align with my own sense of logic where these matters are concerned. Do the implications of the text lead to absurd or false consequences? Once again, similar to what I talked about before, but as you play it out. What are some of those implications for societies, for you as an individual, for the entire world? Are important aspects of the issue overlooked? So are there some glaring examples that you can think of concepts, ideas, parts of the argument that are not included, that if this person had it to do over again, you would advise them they should include that? Finally, how well did the author actually in fact accomplish her or his goal? It's a very good question to ask. Some final tips. After you've finished, review what you have read. So perhaps you have highlighted, perhaps you have put notes in the margin. If you are a really great student, this is at least my bias, you probably have even outlined at least the key points of the text. It's a good idea to keep a philosophical notebook in which you record your notes on the readings. I apologize, my phone is ringing. You can probably hear that. It's a good idea to keep a philosophical notebook just to kind of keep track of what you have thought while you're reading through these things. I hope this is helpful. Enjoy reading philosophy. It's tremendously rich. You are reading some of the greatest ideas ever written down, and it is hopefully expanding your consciousness and leading to a true sense of enrichment.